Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving deep, really deep into a concept that's kind of at the heart of, well, a lot of philosophy, the principle of sufficient reason.
Yeah, this idea that everything needs a reason, a cause, a ground. It's been a huge deal for thinkers going way, way back, and it still gets debated like crazy.
Right, because who doesn't love a good why? But what we're going to unpack today, using a whole bunch of sources and different viewpoints, is just how powerful this PSR really is. And maybe how tricky it can get, too.
Absolutely. We're talking about the very idea of intelligibility here, whether the universe makes sense, whether everything makes sense, even the little stuff like...
Okay, yeah, like, my coffee cup is blue. Does that need a reason? Is it not enough that it just is?
Well, that's exactly what the PSR wants us to question. It's this bold claim that even the simplest facts, they can't just be brute, random occurrences. There has to be a sufficient reason why they are the way they are. No free passes, even for coffee cups.
So, if I'm getting this right, the basic idea, at its core, is that for any fact, let's call it F, there's got to be some reason why F is the case.
You got it. Sometimes philosophers get fancy and say for every X there's a Y, such that Y is the sufficient reason for X. But it's the same idea.
Okay, but like, even just saying that out loud, I can already feel the rabbit hole opening up. What's the reason for that reason? And so on, forever. My brain hurts already.
Haha. Yeah, the potential for infinite regress, that's one of the classic headaches with the PSR. And then there's the whole question of what even counts as a reason. Is it a cause, an explanation, some kind of metaphysical grounding? And is this reason something out there in the world, or is it more about how we understand things?
See, this is what I love about philosophy. Start with something seemingly simple. End up questioning the very fabric of reality. It's like, is the PSR saying how things are, or is it more like a rule for how we should think about things?
You're hitting on another key distinction here. Philosophers talk about a factive PSR, which says the principle is true, full stop, reality works this way. And then there's the regulative PSR, which says it's more like a requirement for us to even make sense of the world.
So like, a factive person would say everything actually has a reason, whether we know it or not. But a regulative person might say, even if something seems totally random, we should still keep searching for an explanation because that's how we make sense of things.
Exactly. It's about our commitment to intelligibility. Now, before we get too lost in the weeds, it's worth pointing out that the PSR, it's not just one thing, it's more like a family of principles with all these subtle variations depending on what we think needs a reason, what counts as a reason, and so on.
Okay, so multiple PSRs running around, and then on top of that, we've got this infinite regress problem, like I mentioned. Plus, what about things that maybe explain themselves? That seems kind of fishy. And couldn't you just say some things are just brute facts, no explanation needed, like give up already?
Right, and those are the big three dilemmas that the PSR always runs into. Philosophers call it the Agrippin trilemma. Brute facts, infinite regress, self-explanation. Pick your poison. Choosing which version of the PSR you like often means figuring out how to deal with one of these.
Yeah, and even choosing how to deal with them. Like, why you prefer one solution over another, that probably needs its own reason too, right? It all gets a little meta.
Exactly. It shows how deep this principle goes. Okay, so with all that in mind, where do we even begin? Well, let's go back in time, way back to one of the philosophical heavyweights, Baruch Spinoza.
Spinoza. Now, he's a guy who really took the PSR seriously.
He did. Even in his early writings, when he was still wrestling with Descartes' ideas, he had this powerful statement: nothing exists of which it cannot be asked, what is the cause or reason why it exists?
Pretty bold, huh?
Yeah, no messing around. And he tied this to the idea that existence itself is a positive thing. Like, something needs a real push to exist. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere.
That's right. He was big on the principle ex nihilo nihil fit, from nothing, nothing comes. So for Spinoza, everything that exists, it's got to have some kind of positive cause, either within itself or from something else. No magical poofing into being.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But, and I'm just looking at our notes here, there's something about Spinoza maybe changing his mind a bit later on. Something about a principle that does not have a cause. Doesn't that kind of contradict the whole PSR thing?
Ah, good catch. That's from his treatise on the emendation of the intellect. It does seem like he's suggesting there might be at least one principle, something that can be understood entirely through itself without needing any external cause.
So, like a special exception to the rule.
Maybe. Some scholars think he was hinting at God here, like everything else needs a reason outside itself, but God, well, maybe God's existence is self-explanatory.
Okay, so maybe not a contradiction, but definitely a super interesting wrinkle. But then, how does all this play out in Spinoza's big famous work, The Ethics? That seems like where the PSR would really shine.
You're right, it's woven into the whole structure of the book. Take Axiom 2 in Part 1. What cannot be conceived through another must be conceived through itself. Spinoza really linked the idea of conceiving something with understanding its explanation.
So, like, if you can understand it, it must be explainable either by something else or just by itself.
Exactly. And then there's Axiom 3, which gets even more to the point. From a given determinate cause, the effect follows necessarily, and conversely, if there is no determinate cause, it is impossible for an effect to follow. That last part, it really sounds like he's saying, no cause, no existence, everything needs something.
Wow, okay. But did he ever actually, like, straight up say the PSR, not just kind of imply it with those axioms?
He did. In Proposition 11, Scholium II, he puts it right out there. For each thing, there must be assigned a cause or reason, both for its existence and for its non-existence. And that non-existence part is important because it lets him make his big argument for God.
Oh, right, the cosmological argument. If God didn't exist, there'd have to be a reason why not. But God's supposed to be self-caused, so the reason would have to be some contradiction in God's own nature. But Spinoza's like, nope, no contradiction, therefore God.
That's it. Classic Spinoza. But even though he uses the PSR to argue for some pretty huge ideas, there's actually a lot of debate among scholars about just how central the PSR is to his whole system.
So, like, some people think it's the driving force behind all his big ideas, while others are like, nah, he just uses it for certain things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like Della Rocca, he argues that the PSR is behind Spinoza's necessitarianism, so the idea that everything happens necessarily, and his identity of indiscernibles, which is that if two things are totally alike, they're the same thing, and even his substance monism, that there's only one substance, God or nature, all that from the PSR.
Whoa, but then other people are like, hold on, maybe he's not that committed to it.
Right. Some say it's mainly about explaining existence and non-existence and maybe a few other things, but not everything. It's a real puzzle for Spinoza scholars. And then there's this whole idea of a double use of the PSR that Della Rocca came up with.
Okay, now that sounds interesting. Double use. Like, what's he doing with it twice?
Well, Della Rocca says Spinoza uses the PSR on two levels. First, yeah, everything needs an explanation. Pretty straightforward. But then second, and this is the more radical part, he thinks Spinoza's saying those explanations, they all boil down to intelligibility itself. Like, to exist is to be understandable, to be part of this web of reason.
So causation, power, even existence itself, it's all about being intelligible. That's a big claim.
It is. But it runs into some trouble when you remember Spinoza's thing about thought and extension being totally separate. If everything's ultimately about being understandable, how do you keep those two apart?
Yeah, good point. Okay, so back to those three pesky dilemmas, the Agrippin trilemma. How did Spinoza, Mr. PSR, try to get around those?
Well, first off, brute facts. No way. Spinoza's not having that. Everything needs a reason. He's okay with a little bit of self-explanation, but only for things where their very nature means they have to exist or not exist.
Like, a square circle can't exist because it's just contradictory.
Right. And for Spinoza, God's essence includes existence, so God kind of explains God's self in a way. But that one's still debated, of course.
Of course. What about infinite regress? Doesn't seem like he'd be a fan of explanations that just go on forever.
He wasn't. He thought there could be infinite chains of things within God or nature, but those chains are all ultimately grounded in God, who's the necessary being, the uncaused cause.
So, like, God's the anchor that stops the infinite regress from spinning off into nothingness.
Exactly. And he even had a response to that classic argument against infinite regress, the one that says it's just impossible.
Oh, yeah, the one where people are like, if the universe needed a cause and that cause needed a cause and so on forever, then how could anything even exist now?
Right, that one. Spinoza borrowed an idea from a medieval philosopher, Hasdai Crescus, and said the real distinction isn't just between finite and infinite causes, but between chains of contingent causes, things that could have been different, and a chain that ends in something necessary, something that has to exist.
So for Spinoza, God's that necessary thing, and God's existence is self-explanatory, so no more infinite regress worries.
You got it. Spinoza's system is really elegant, but man, is it complex. Okay, ready for our next PSR superstar? Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. This is the guy who actually gave the PSR its name.
Oh yeah, Leibniz, another big name. But how did he think about the PSR? Was it the same as Spinoza?
Similar, but definitely with his own twists. Leibniz not only named the PSR, he made it like one of the twin pillars of his whole philosophy, right alongside the principle of contradiction.
And he really went all in, right? Didn't limit it to just facts about what exists.
Mm.
He applied it to truths in general, even events happening. Like everything had to have a sufficient reason.
That's right. And he even said explicitly, echoing Spinoza, that there's a reason why things are the way they are and not some other way. And he was super clear that this wasn't just some rule for us, for humans. He really thought it was built into the fabric of reality. It's just that we finite minds, we don't always grasp those reasons.
Makes sense. But then he makes this distinction between the PSR and the principle of contradiction. And he links them to different kinds of truths, right? Necessary truths versus contingent truths.
That's right. For Leibniz, the principle of contradiction, that's all about those rock solid, can't be otherwise truths like in math and logic. But the PSR, that's the boss of the contingent truths, the stuff that could have been different. And he really thought the PSR was the key to metaphysics, natural theology, physics, all those areas where we're trying to figure out why the world is the way it is.
So different domains, different principles. But he still thought both principles were universally true, right? Like even a necessary truth, it still has to have a sufficient reason.
Exactly. It's just that different kinds of truths depend on different principles for their explanation or how we understand them. Okay, so we've talked about how broad Leibniz's view of the PSR was, but what did he even mean by sufficient reason? Like, what is that thing?
Yeah, because it sounds like he had a few different ways of thinking about it, depending on what he was talking about.
He did. Sometimes he talked about a sufficient reason as being like an a priori proof, but not in the same way Kant did later on. For Leibniz, a priori often meant reasoning from causes to effects, following the causal chain.
So, like, a good sufficient reason would not only show you why something is true, but also reveal the causes that made it happen.
That's it. And this idea of proof and explanation, it's really tied up with his big, famous idea, the conceptual containment theory of truth.
Ah, yes, the one where the predicate's already tucked away inside the subject of a true statement. So Caesar crossed the Rubicon is true because the concept of crossing the Rubicon is somehow already part of the concept of Caesar. But doesn't that make all truths analytic? And if they're all analytic, how can some be necessary and some be contingent?
You're sharp. Leibniz knew that was a problem. So he came up with this idea of infinite analysis. Necessary truths, like in math, they have a finite analysis. You can unpack the concepts and see the connection. But contingent truths, they need an infinite analysis, a chain of conceptual unpacking that just goes on forever. And only an infinite mind, like God, could really grasp it fully.
Okay, so for contingent truths, the sufficient reason is like this infinitely complex connection between concepts. Heady stuff.
It is. But there's another side to Leibniz's view of sufficient reason, a more, I guess you could say, metaphysical side. This is where his idea of primitive active force comes in.
Oh, right. The monads, those little self-contained units of reality that he thought everything was made of.
Exactly. Each monad has this internal force that drives everything that happens within it. And since Leibniz didn't think monads interacted causally with each other, that internal force is like the sufficient reason for the whole history of that monad.
So is the sufficient reason for Leibniz this logical conceptual thing or this fundamental metaphysical force? Or both somehow?
That's a great question, and one that scholars are still debating. Some say it's two sides of the same coin. Others think he might have been a bit inconsistent in how he used the idea. But okay, ready for the big one. The best of all possible worlds.
Yes. Leibniz's famous and sometimes infamous theodicy. How does the PSR fit into that whole picture of a perfectly good God creating a world with, let's face it, some pretty bad stuff going on?
Well, Leibniz argues that this world, even with all its flaws, it's still the best one God could have created. And that's not just him being optimistic. He says it follows from the PSR itself.
So God, being perfectly rational, must have had a good reason to create this world instead of any other.
Exactly. And that reason for Leibniz is that God saw this world as the best overall, the one with the most goodness and the least evil, all things considered.
So the sufficient reason for all the contingent stuff in our world, it might actually lie in this bigger picture of the best possible world, taking into account all the alternatives.
That's the idea. Heady stuff, but okay, back down to earth a bit. We've talked about what Leibniz thought a sufficient reason was, but did he ever try to prove that the PSR itself is true? Like, why should we believe this whole thing anyway?
Yeah, because so far it's kind of been, well, if the PSR is true then, but why should we accept that if in the first place?
Good point. Leibniz did try to argue for the PSR, though his arguments aren't exactly slam dunks. One way he tried was to define sufficient reason and requisite, like a necessary condition, and then say that if you have all the necessary conditions for something, then that's a sufficient reason for it to exist.
But isn't that kind of circular? Like you're assuming the PSR to prove the PSR?
Yeah, a lot of people think so. He also tried to use his conceptual containment theory of truth to argue for it, but that theory has its own baggage, as we've seen. And then he made a kind of inductive argument, saying, look, we see sufficient reasons all over the place, and no one's found a clear case where it doesn't hold, so probably it's true universally.
Okay, so not the most airtight proofs, but he definitely believed it. But more importantly, how did he actually use the PSR? Like, what kind of philosophical work did it do for him?
Well, he had a favorite move, kind of like a philosophical power move. He'd assume the opposite of what he wanted to prove, and then show how that would lead to something without a sufficient reason, which would violate the PSR.
So like a proof by contradiction.
Exactly. And since the PSR can't be wrong, the original assumption must be wrong too. And that means what he wanted to prove must be true.
Clever. Any examples of that in action?
Tons. His argument for God is like that, the whole contingent beings needing a necessary ground. And he famously used it to argue for the identity of indiscernibles, that two things can't be totally alike and still be separate.
Because if they were, God wouldn't have a reason to treat them differently, and that would violate the PSR.
Yep. And he even used it against the idea of absolute space and absolute time, the kind Newton believed in. He said if space was just this big, empty container, God wouldn't have a reason to put the universe in this spot rather than that spot.
Because all points in space would be the same, so no sufficient reason to pick one over another. I'm starting to see why Leibniz loved this principle.
He really did. Okay, ready for a slight change of pace. Let's talk about Émilie du Châtelet.
Du Châtelet, isn't she more known for her work on science? Like with Newton's physics. What's she doing in our PSR deep dive?
Well, she was a philosopher too, and a pretty great one. In her book, Foundations of Physics, she really tried to ground Newtonian science in a solid metaphysical framework. And guess what? She thought the principle of contradiction and the PSR were the two most fundamental principles for doing philosophy at all.
So she was a PSR fan too, but it sounds like she was more interested in justifying the PSR itself, like figuring out why it should be accepted rather than just using it to prove other stuff.
That's right. And justifying something as fundamental as the PSR, that's a tall order. But she gave it a good shot.
So how'd she go about it?
Her main move was to say that if you deny the PSR, things get really messy, really fast. Like, if things could just happen without any reason, then you couldn't be sure of anything, even basic stuff like whether the laws of physics will stay the same tomorrow.
Oh, wow. Yeah. If the PSR is false, then maybe things just pop into and out of existence randomly. The sun explodes for no reason. Not a good look for science.
Exactly. She thought denying the PSR would completely undermine our ability to understand the world because we couldn't rely on anything being stable or consistent.
And she even linked it to even more basic ideas like equality and identity.
Yeah, she said even those depend on the PSR. Like, if two things seem equal now, but they could just change without any reason, then how do you know they'll stay equal? And if an object can change completely randomly, how can you even say it's the same object anymore?
Okay, that's really making me think.
Yeah.
But there's a little red flag in the notes here. It says some people think she might have assumed that these reasons have to be accessible to us, to humans.
Ah, good point. That's the worry about anthropocentrism, centering things around human understanding. If her argument depends on us being able to grasp the reasons, then it might not be a full defense of the PSR, it's a defense of how we need it.
But maybe there's another way to read it. Like, maybe she's saying that even if we can't always understand the ultimate reasons, the PSR itself is still a requirement for us to have any coherent picture of the world at all.
That's a great way to put it. It's about the PSR as a regulative principle. Okay, so we've seen Spinoza, we've seen Leibniz, we've seen du Châtelet, all big PSR fans. But were there any hints of this idea even earlier in philosophy, like before the PSR was a named thing?
Yeah, good question. It feels like something this fundamental. It probably popped up in different forms throughout history.
Oh, absolutely. Like way back to the pre-Socratics. Anaximander, for example, he argued that the Earth stays in the middle of the cosmos because it has no reason to move in any particular direction. Sounds familiar, right?
Yeah, kind of like, why would it go there? No reason, so it stays put.
Exactly. And Parmenides, the being, cannot come from non-being guy. He was basically saying there'd be no reason for being to appear at one time rather than another if it could just come from nothing.
So even back then, they were thinking about reasons and explanations. What about in like more practical areas? Was the PSR lurking there too?
Oh, yeah. Think about Archimedes, the guy with the lever in the bathtub. His principle of equilibrium, equal weights at equal distances will balance. That's basically saying that without some kind of imbalance, there's no reason for the scale to tip one way or the other.
Whoa, I never thought about it like that.
Leibniz himself was a big fan of Archimedes and saw him as an early PSR thinker. Then, later on, in the medieval period, you have Avicenna, a major Islamic philosopher, arguing that contingent beings, the ones that don't have to exist, they need a cause outside themselves. And Peter Abelard in the West, he even said that God must have created the best possible world.
Because any other world would mean there was a bad reason, and God wouldn't do that.
Exactly. So yeah, the PSR, or at least the kind of thinking that leads to the PSR, it's been around for a long time.
But it sounds like, even with those big names, not everyone was on board with a totally unrestricted PSR. Our notes mention Plato and Descartes as maybe not being fully committed.
Right. Plato, even though he says everything needs a cause, he also talks about this realm of disorderly motion that existed before the demiurge, the divine craftsman, came along and ordered everything. And he doesn't really give a cause for that disorder.
So, like, a little bit of brute factiness sneaking in there.
Maybe. And Descartes, even though he used the causal argument for God, he also thought God created the eternal truths, like in math and logic, freely and indifferently.
So no deeper reason why those truths are the way they are, just God's choice.
Right. Okay, fast forward a bit. What about the 18th century, the Enlightenment? What happened to the PSR then?
Well, that's where Hume comes in, right? The big skeptic about causation.
Exactly. Hume really challenged that idea of a necessary connection between cause and effect. He said all we really observe is one event following another, not some hidden necessary link between them. And that created a problem for some traditional ways of defending the PSR, the ones that relied on a strong idea of causal necessity.
So, like, if causation is just a habit of mind, how can you say everything must have a cause?
Exactly. But even with Hume's skepticism, the PSR didn't disappear. Christian Wolff, he was huge in German philosophy, and he was a big PSR fan. He even tried to come up with rigorous proofs for it, distinguishing between the ratio essendi, the reason for being, and the ratio fiendi, the reason for becoming.
That's complicated.
It was. And Kant, who was influenced by Wolff early on, he ended up rejecting those proofs. But even Kant, the great skeptic in his own right, he had a place for a limited version of the PSR.
Right, his transcendental deduction of the principle of causality. It's like a PSR specifically for how events happen in time.
Exactly. He said that to even have experience of the world, we got to assume that every event has a cause. But crucially, he said this only applies to the phenomenal world, the world as we experience it, not the noumenal world, the world in itself.
So a kind of Kantian compromise.
Yeah.
PSR for experience, but not necessarily for reality as a whole.
Right. But some of his contemporaries weren't happy with that compromise. Salomon Maimon, for example, he was a sharp critic of Kant, and he wanted a stronger, more unrestricted PSR.
Back to the hardcore version.
Yep. He thought Kant's system couldn't really explain how our thoughts and our sense perceptions connect up without a stronger PSR. And he thought the whole point of philosophy and science was to try to satisfy the PSR, to find explanations for everything.
Okay, so even Kant couldn't escape the pull of the PSR. What about Hegel and Schopenhauer? They were both big on reason and explanation.
They were. Hegel, in his Science of Logic, he used the concept of ground, which is pretty close to the PSR. For him, finding the ground of something is like the basic movement of thought itself. It's how we understand the connection between things.
So very Hegelian, everything's interconnected, and the PSR is part of how we understand those connections.
Exactly. And Schopenhauer, well, he wrote his whole doctoral dissertation on the PSR. He called it On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason.
Dedicated. What were the four roots?
Well, he distinguished between the reason of being, the reason of becoming, the reason of knowing, and the reason of acting. So basically different kinds of reasons for different kinds of things, all stemming from how we connect up our perceptions and thoughts.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, literally centuries of philosophy. But what about today? Is the PSR still a thing in contemporary philosophy?
Oh yeah, it's still going strong. One big change is that people now often talk about grounding instead of just reason or cause.
Grounding. So like, what's the ground of something's existence?
Exactly. And grounding, it's supposed to be this special kind of metaphysical explanation that's not the same as just saying something caused something else. It's usually seen as being asymmetrical, so if A grounds B, then B doesn't ground A. And irreflexive, meaning nothing grounds itself. And transitive, so if A grounds B and B grounds C, then A grounds C.
Okay, I'm following,
Yeah.
sort of.
Yeah.
Any examples of grounding in action?
Sure, like think about a vase. It's fragile, right? That's a dispositional property, meaning it has the potential to break. But that fragility, it's grounded in the vase's physical structure, the way its molecules are arranged. Or take meaning, like the meaning of words. That's a semantic fact, but it's grounded in non-semantic facts, like how people use those words.
Okay, so grounding is kind of like the new, improved PSR.
You could say that. And it helps with some of those classic dilemmas. Like Dasgupta, he's a contemporary philosopher. He says the PSR is all about grounding by autonomous facts. These are facts that can't be grounded in anything else. They're kind of fundamental.
So, like, instead of brute facts or infinite regress, you have these foundational facts that everything else is grounded in.
That's the idea. But even grounding has its own controversies. Like, some people think maybe some things can ground themselves, which would really shake things up.
Always got to keep those philosophers on their toes. But has anyone tried to actually justify the PSR lately? Like, give us a good reason to believe in the whole grounding thing.
They have. Amassi, for example, he argues that whenever we try to understand the structure of anything, like in science or philosophy, we're already assuming the PSR, or at least a regulative version of it.
So, like, if we want to make sense of the world, we got to assume there are reasons to be found. And since trying to find those reasons has worked pretty well so far, that's a good practical reason to keep believing in the PSR.
That's his argument. And speaking of reasons and explanations, there's been some interesting work lately on the idea of surprisingness and how it relates to the PSR.
Surprisingness, like being surprised by something.
Yeah. Philosophers have noticed that we tend to really want explanations for things that are surprising, things that violate our expectations, but we're not always bothered by things that are just unlikely, even if they're statistically more improbable.
So, like, if I flip a coin and it lands on heads 100 times in a row, that's unlikely, but I probably want an explanation, like, is the coin weighted or something? But if I roll the die and get a 6, that's less likely, but I probably wouldn't need a special reason for it.
Exactly. And that suggests that maybe we're already operating with a kind of PSR, even unconsciously. We assume that things that break our expectations, they need a special reason, while things that fit into our picture of how the world works, they don't.
It's like that saying, the universe is not required to make sense to you. But maybe we're the ones who require the universe to make sense.
Maybe we are. And that brings us to the last point I wanted to mention. Even after all this time, the role of the PSR in ethics and political philosophy, it's still kind of underexplored.
Really? But it seems like something this fundamental, it would have a lot to say about how we think about morality and justice.
It totally would. Like, if you think about the PSR, it could be used to challenge any ethical or political principle that's just based on intuition or tradition.
So, like, instead of just saying, this is wrong or this is right, because that's how it's always been, you'd have to actually give a reason why.
Exactly. And it could even be used in those big debates about the value of human life. Like, why do humans deserve special consideration? The PSR would push us to articulate those reasons.
Okay, so, after this deep, deep dive, where do we stand? Does everything really have a reason?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've seen how the PSR has been a driving force in philosophy for centuries, from Spinoza to Leibniz to du Châtelet, and even to thinkers today. It's shaped how we understand existence, causation, knowledge, even ethics and politics.
It's one of those ideas that, whether you agree with it or not, it makes you think differently about, well, everything.
Absolutely. And as you go out into the world today, think about something that seems totally random, something you can't explain. Does the PSR whisper in your ear, telling you there must be a reason, even if you don't know it? Or are there some things that we just have to accept as brute facts, no matter how much it bugs us?
Those are the kinds of questions the PSR forces us to confront, and that's why it's still so relevant, even after all this time.